and welcome back, everybody. And I'd like to begin today's session by taking a minute to come into this moment. And today I'm not going to use a bell. I'm going to just ask everyone to take a deep breath as your cue. So taking a deep breath in and exhale slowly. And bringing awareness to coming into this moment, coming into your seat. If you like, closing your eyes and sinking into the body. Perhaps feeling the pressure of the floor underneath your feet. Feeling the strength of the chair holding you. Continuing to breathe deeply and slowly and evenly, checking around the body to see if there's any tension in any muscles. Already today. And then when you're ready, if you've closed your eyes, opening them, and we'll begin our presentation. And today we're going to talk about mindfulness and the stress response, so that the fight or flight reaction, in a very real sense, is what happens in the body, is the body prepares for battle when it perceives that there's a stressor. I'd like to begin by addressing some questions that came in during the week that I think are pretty important. And so the first one is about pain. And so the person says, I do have a question that came up today during the meditation, and it has come up during the first two webinars as well. Today we are supposed to notice where our minds go as we focus on our breathing. For me, my mind and awareness keep getting diverted towards noticing the intense chronic pain I have. And this pain and the medications don't help me much, so I have no choice but to meditate while experiencing a lot of pain. My mind gets diverted away from the breathing sensations and notices the pain and discomfort that I'm in. So what are we supposed to do with that? Are we supposed to keep noticing it, or are we trying to ignore it or get rid of it? And so the mindfulness way of being with the pain is, as I mentioned previously, is making sure that your medication is up to date and you've had enough medication and that you're completely as well medicated as you can be. And so when you're sitting with the breath, if the pain diverts the attention, as best as possible, finding the edges of the pain and see if there's a way to relax around it. So see if there's a way to relax any pressure or pushing against the pain that you find there. And as much as possible, breathing into the pain, breathing into the sensation in the body, and trying as best as possible to relax around the edges of it. So sometimes when one pushes against something and doesn't want to feel it, that tends to tense the muscles, and then it intensifies the pain. So as it seems to be somewhat counterintuitive to try and relax into the pain, but if you could try to experiment with relaxing into it and relaxing around it and holding it as gently as possible. So if you haven't tried, give that a try and see what that feels like. the next question is, can one use restorative yoga instead of gentle yoga for chronic pain? I think you can use any kind of movement. It's basically a mindful movement. It's a gentle, mindful movement. So as long as you're present in the body when you're doing the movement, then it's considered to be a mindfulness exercise. This next question I think is very important, and the writer says, I'm having some difficulty understanding how to make use of the meditations when I'm, for example, out and about or driving in the car or engaged in a social situation, but also in severe pain. In my case, the pain is caused by back problems. As the day progresses and gravity exerts its force on my only relief comes from lying down. Is it possible that practicing the meditations will carry over to this painful time of day and allow me to be upright, either sitting or standing for more hours in the day? So the mindfulness is about noticing what is in the body and what is going on in the body. And so if the pain is coming as a result of exposure to gravity for a prolonged period of time, then listening to the body is the important thing to do in that particular situation. Is that if the body needs to lie down, then that would be the best thing to do for yourself, is to lie down and listen to what the body is asking for. Is that the pain is coming and saying, I need to rest now. And so as inconvenient as it might be in our day, sometimes it's really important to listen to what our body needs of us. So it's a gentle kindness and listening to what is required in the situation. So attending to what the body asks of us. And then maybe what that might mean in terms of organizing one's day is to change it around slightly so that you can plan for times of rest in between when you need to be upright. So it's with a kind gentleness, looking to see how you can help yourself in that situation. Another question that has been asked is, I'm having difficulty in what to do when I notice what I'm doing and I have a certain thought, then I label it as planning, and then I return to meditating. So basically what we're doing with the mindfulness is practicing a muscle, if you will. So like a bicep muscle, is that each time the mind wanders away, you return to the breath. So each time the mind wanders away, you notice what the thought is, and then you return to the breath. So in a way, it's practicing a new way of being with our thoughts, in identifying what the thoughts are and then returning to the breath without getting involved in the story. Another question is that I keep nodding off, and when I get relaxed, I keep nodding off. And so in that case, sometimes what happens in our lives is that we actually are exhausted and we need to sleep. So the body again is asking for something that it requires of us. So in this case, possibly sleep. But also, please remember that the body only knows two ways of being, and that is either flat out sleeping or sitting up and busy, busy, busy. And so we're trying to teach the mind-body a new way of being, and that is a place of quiet awareness while being awake. So it's a whole new way of being. Many of us have not spent much time in this quiet, awake place where we can be completely present and not go away with our thoughts. So being completely present and not going off into a story and not nodding off. So it's teaching the body-mind a new way to be. And then the other question in here I think is more of a comment, but I think very important. I'm a healthcare professional who suffers chronic pain. I've been taking pain management courses and meditation for the past 8 months. I agree wholeheartedly with the benefits of mindfulness and other techniques. It has taken me all of the 8 months to reap some benefits, and it has been worth it. I find that listening to guided meditation and continuing to attend workshops have been key to making the progress. My advice is to persevere with the meditation, not just taking one session. It can take many. When can people expect to see results? So the results are unpredictable, actually, unpredictable, and it is called practice. So it's called a meditation practice, and the results may come at unexpected times, but indeed the constant returning to the breath is what's important. And even some of the people who are somewhat ascended gurus of meditation say that their mind still wanders away and they still have to practice in order to stay present. So it's not something that ever comes and stays forever. It's something that requires constant and ongoing persistence with working with one's thoughts and one's mind to be in the present moment and continuing to practice this new way of being with the mind and body. And so if there are any questions that come up during this presentation, please email them to Michael and we can address them either at the end of this session or at the beginning of next. So I think I'm going to move on with the presentation now. And today we are going to talk about the actual stress response. So this is my most beautiful cat. Her name is Coco Chanel, and she knows exactly how to relax. When she is relaxed, she doesn't have one single tense muscle in her body, and she completely drapes herself over wherever she is lying, and she's completely serene. No one has to tell the cat how to relax because she knows exactly how to do it. However, with people, it's slightly different. We tend to have a bit of difficulty letting go of any muscle tension and being in the present moment in a quiet, alert state. So what happens when our body perceives that it is under stress? So this stress response is a very ancient response that basically was formulated in the caveman days when we needed to be able to escape from very real dangers. And the stress response has not modified itself at all during the time of our evolution to right now. Is the stress response remains the same. And this is a picture of the sympathetic nervous system, which is the nervous system that gets stimulated in response to the perception of stress. And so it basically is the brain, the spinal cord. There is something called the sympathetic trunk, which are a bunch of nerve ganglions just outside of the spinal cord, and then the solar plexus. And as you can see from this picture, that when we perceive stress, this response communicates with every single part of our body. So it goes into the iris and the eye and helps the pupil to dilate so we can escape from the danger. It goes into the heart, causes the heart to beat faster so that we can escape. We can get some more blood to our muscles to be able to run faster, to get away from the danger. It goes into the lungs to help us breathe more quickly and faster and get the oxygen to the muscles again to help us run. It innervates the stomach and the pancreas and the small intestine, and what it does there is it stops those functions from happening. It basically ceases digestion, any kind of function for the pancreas or the digestive system or the small intestine, because if one is under stress, it's not the time to rest and digest your food. And so the whole blood supply is diverted away from the stomach, the pancreas, small intestine. It goes to the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland basically is a gland that sits on top of the kidneys, and it causes more and more hormones to be stimulated, to be produced through the adrenal gland to keep the actual sympathetic nervous system response going. It goes again to the large intestine, and again it diverts the blood away from there because it's not the time that you want to be resting your intestine, and to the bladder, so there may be a perception of needing to go to the bathroom at that point in time. So those are all the things that happen. It's a very powerful reaction, very overwhelming to the body. And so these are the feelings that sometimes people have, is this racing heart, dry mouth, the gastrointestinal difficulties because the blood has been diverted away from the stomach. And sometimes there's diarrhea, gas, sometimes belching. There's muscle tension that happens, so a tightening of the muscles, because when you're trying to escape, there's a need to actually use the muscles. There's a tendency to tense. Then there's this often a headache. And then hyperventilating, so breathing deeply and sometimes frequent sighing, trying to get more and more air. And then this sweating, this frequent urination, and the feeling of agitation and anxiety. Often disturbed sleep, so difficulty sleeping, and then a change in appetite. So this is an ongoing chronic stress situation. So what happens is that our mind does not differentiate between a real danger and a thought. So, for example, in our picture, this man is running away from a hippopotamus, and he needs to escape because the hippopotamus really is theoretically going to attack him, so he needs to get away from the hippopotamus. But what happens with our mind is that we can't escape from our mind. We carry our mind with us. And the mind, when it perceives that we are under stress, then it responds in exactly the same way as if a tiger were chasing us. There's no difference. We can't differentiate between real and imagined situations. So, for example, if we're worried about paying our Visa bill, for example, and we look at our Visa bill and we don't have the money and we lament about not having the money to pay the Visa bill, even though it's not something that it's chasing us or trying to attack us, our mind and body respond in exactly the same way as if we were running away from a lion or a tiger or a hippopotamus. There's no difference in the response. So what we need to remember is that is the importance of the thoughts. The thoughts and being aware of what the thoughts are and how we treat ourselves, what we say to ourselves, how much time we allow ourselves to spend with our thoughts and dwell on them. We need to remember that those thoughts are very real physiologically. So they may be just in our mind, but they create a whole physiological response in the body. And when we have ongoing stressors or ongoing perceived stressors, we continue to perpetuate the stress response. And essentially what we do is we bathe our body in abnormal fluid. We bathe our body in fluid that is laden with all the chemicals of the stress response. I wanted to just think back to last week when we looked at a pleasant situation and we looked at what happened in the body, and then we looked at an unpleasant situation and the difference between those two. And what happened with the unpleasant is that there was a perception of some of the things that happen with the stress response. So a tightening of the chest, a racing of the heart, a feeling of tension. So when there's a perception of unpleasant in the mind, then that same response comes into the body. And interestingly, when people do research on the stress response, many researchers ask people to simply sit in a chair and remember the last stressful event that they went through and think about it for a few moments. So they sit in a chair with all kinds of blood pressure cuffs and sometimes getting blood and getting samples of the saliva. And when someone only thinks about what happened to them that was a very stressful situation or a very unpleasant situation, that response is just as powerful as when it happened. So when we actually allow ourselves to ruminate about something, we are placing our mind and body into a stressful situation one more time over again. And so what happens is that the body continues to secrete the chemicals associated with the stress response, and the tissues continue to be bathed in this abnormal fluid. And so when we continue to allow it to happen, what happens is basically long-term physiological effects of this fight and flight overdrive. So that long-term, if, for example, we get up in the morning and we have a fight with our significant other, and then we get into traffic and we get really stressed out in traffic and tighten up the muscles in response to the drivers around us, and we get to work and we maybe have a disagreement with one of our colleagues, and so on through the day, then by the time that one gets home, there are so many chemicals in the body, it basically has gone on for the entire day, and we've allowed ourselves to react to every single situation. So what happens with the long-term physiological effects of this is that things like the thyroid gland burns out, basically, so the thyroid endocrine burnout. Sometimes what happens is that the blood has been diverted away from the pancreas for so long that it doesn't function properly anymore. There comes a situation of obesity, diabetes. Sometimes the chemicals that are secreted by the adrenal gland or by the brain, it gets depleted, so serotonin in the brain gets depleted. The epinephrine and norepinephrine become at abnormal levels, and then a situation where it's called a lack of ability to experience pleasure. It's called anhedonia. So that is a long-term result of too much stress for too long of a time. And so the next slide is high blood pressure, often attributed to long-term chronic stress, heart disease, because the heart tissue is constantly bathed in the abnormal fluid. And when they look at hearts that have been under stress for a prolonged period of time, there's actually blackened areas in the heart tissue. Can lead to cardiac failure and infertility, so difficulty in conceiving a child, and then immune suppression. Basically, our immune system is very much affected by this chronic, long-term, ongoing stress response, and our ability to defend ourselves against viruses and other kinds of bacteria and bugs becomes suppressed, and we tend to get sick. And then sometimes what happens is it's autonomic stress-related diseases. So many, many different types of diseases can arise as a result of chronic stress. So I want to talk about just what we can do through the mindfulness work to try and prevent this from happening. And I think in the very beginning of our talking together, we discussed a little bit about how we actually have learned how to cope over maybe the last 20, 30, 40 years, and we tend to have our own way of responding to situations, and we've learned it very well. And so however we've learned to be with situations in our life, we learn from our family of origin likely, and from practicing it for many, many, many years. And so we actually get really, really good at the way in which we respond. So through the mindfulness, what we're trying to do is look at it with a gentle, kind, objective view of how it is that we do respond. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens with our mind. Our mind is it tends to get into its own way of responding, and because we practice it so often, we get really good at it. So sometimes what happens is that we get into mental ruts, we get into negative moods, we get into things of only seeing the bad things in some situation, and in only remembering the bad things in situations, and then eventually somewhat trouble remembering of what happens. So in addition, there's attention difficulties. Sometimes we have difficulty making a decision. We really have a lot of trouble learning a new association. There's really hard to learn a new way of coping, so any new way of being is difficult to learn, and sometimes really hard to see things in a new way. Sometimes really hard to look at things through beginner's eyes. And then sort of a feeling of just plain jaded and fed up with things. So that tends to happen with this chronic stress response. So what has come recently from the research is that they used to think that our mind and our mind-body was basically written in stone, is that once we were already grown up, our mind couldn't change. But what they have discovered lately is that the mind is plastic, is it has the ability to grow new connections. It has the ability to see things in a new light. It doesn't have to stay with the way in which it is. It can change. And so changing the way in which we think is difficult, for sure, but it's possible. And many times it's really very worthwhile to really recognize the fact that our brain can change the way in which it responds to things. Sometimes because we've practiced a certain way of responding so many times, we tend to think that it's instant and that we have no control over it. But in actual fact, we do have control over the way in which we respond to a situation. So let's talk a little bit more about this way of developing this plastic brain into a way of being better for us. So this is kind of our nerves get into a rut. It tends to get into the way of responding because that pathway is so well practiced that it would take a great deal of effort to move the thinking into a new way of being, so that the nerves get into a rut in a way of responding to a situation. And so sometimes the nerves get locked into this negative association. They get locked into seeing things in a way that we've always practiced. So then that reaction comes up. The first thing that comes up for us is our typical way of responding reaction, and we tend to think that there's no other way of being with it. But in actual fact, there is another way of being with it. We can look at different ways of being. So I want to talk about what some of the research indicates when they talk about personality and how we see the world. These are labels that researchers have given to various kinds of cognitive function. And it does not mean that we are the labels. It doesn't mean that we have no hope of changing from having these types of cognitive thinking. It just is a way of looking at the way in which researchers have found some of the cognitive ways of being that might not be that helpful. And also, I think what happens is that we may have several bits of all of them. We may have several bits of all of them. But these might be some of the things that you may recognize in yourself if you can be really, really honest with yourself and just look within to see, does this happen for me ever? So some of the worldviews that some of the research has shown is that people can be anxious in response to some kind of situation. They can be depressed. They can be angry and hostile, called a type A personality. And then sometimes there's called a type C personality that's just resigned and helpless. So these are the ways in which sometimes people do respond. So if you have recognized any anxiety in yourself, sometimes some of the thoughts that might come out is, what if I do this wrong? I'm going to be fired. So if you're at work, that would then bring up anxiety. So it's maybe just an anxious way of looking at the world. And so it's a constant second guessing of what it is that I might do wrong. So constant worry about something that I might do wrong. So the anxiety is one way of being. Depressed, sometimes people just completely feel down in the dumps and feel like they're all alone in the universe. And so again, these are kind of thoughts that may arise in response to situations in our lives. Sometimes people, when they're depressed, they constantly compare themselves between reality and some ideal way of being or some ideal way of coping. Sometimes there's a lot of self-critical evaluation, a lot of saying some really nasty things to ourselves. Sometimes we underestimate what our resources are, and sometimes we tend to look at the memories of things, and we can only see the bad things that happen. Sometimes the type A person, it's a kind of way of being is that when someone feels like they're being threatened, there's a thought of the world is against me and I'm going to show them. So I'm going to lash out at them before they can lash out at me. So that's another way of possibly being in your mind body. And type A people sometimes can be angry and hostile, sometimes paranoid, sometimes always scanning the world for a threat to their safety. So sometimes looking around and only seeing threat. And type C people, some just have this feeling of overwhelming, completely giving up on the world and saying there is nothing I can do about this. So all of these coping responses are basically a part of all of us, and they come up in different situations. So when we're looking within, and we can notice some of these things that might come up for us, and maybe we might be able to practice a different way of being with what arises. So the thoughts and the ways of coping are not necessarily that helpful often. So with a gentle kindness looking within, we can see the way in which we do respond to a situation. So those are some of the things about type C. And when, as we mentioned before, it's not just the way of responding to the situation that it basically becomes a physiological situation. So if we constantly see the world through a depressed kind of way of seeing the world, it leads to this imbalance between the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, which then affects how our physiology is helping us in our lives. So what happens is that there's this, again, this hyperactive system of fight or flight. There's increased secretion of all the stress chemicals. There's the amygdala, the part in the brain that we talked about in the very first day, which basically is responsible for our emotional reaction. It becomes stimulated, and it actually grows and gets more effective at seeing only the negative. It contributes to the negative memory. And then these immune cytokines, the part of our immune system, it affects those, it decreases them rapidly and intensely. And then we also tend to have very negative emotions, and our basic driver for helping us to get some really good sleep, it's called REM sleep, it doesn't function any longer. It doesn't work properly. So only in response to our thoughts and seeing the world in a particular way, we cause our whole physiology to change. In addition, there's underactive systems, so that the relaxation response doesn't work properly. Our memory and our new learning associations don't work properly. Our behavioral activation of the positive emotions doesn't work properly. We have a really hard time making a decision. And you might remember times in your life when that happens, when you're under a lot of stress. It is hard to make a decision. There's actually a change, more of a change in the immune response, so the natural killer cells that are in our body naturally don't work properly. That we have the burnout of all the stress hormones in the body, and all of our sleep patterns are out of whack. So this parasympathetic nervous system is just as powerful as the sympathetic nervous system, and it stimulates, again, all of the body basically in the reverse way from the sympathetic nervous system. So it goes, again, from the brain and the spinal cord. It goes to all of the parts of the body, similarly to the sympathetic nervous system, but it does so in a way allowing that body part to restore and to repair itself. So it gives that body part the ability to actually mend the tissues when the body is in a relaxation response. So, for example, it stimulates the heart to relax so that the tissue that become necrotic and dead from the stress response can be repaired. So the body can actually remove those cells and replace them with fresh tissue. It allows the stomach to relax so that our digestive processes are done properly and our body can absorb the nutrients. So very, very important. And last week when we talked about the pleasant experience, a lot of the feelings that came up with the pleasant experience, the warmth, the relaxed muscles, a lot of those responses were directly attributable to the relaxation response. So in actually being able to generate this relaxation response. So what I'd like to talk about for our remaining time is how we can go about working with the plastic brain, how we can go about working with this brain and our response that we find in our mind-body. And basically, we see the world through the mind's eye. We actually don't see very clearly. We see through a lot of stuff that goes on in our mind. So, for example, we have cognitive filters that cloud our vision. So an event happens, and it's not really necessarily either positive nor negative. It basically is just an event. Then it goes through our perception, and in our perception, depending on how we've trained our mind to be with any given situation, out will come a reaction. So what I'd like to encourage for this week's homework is actually looking at creating a gap between the event and the reaction that comes out of our mind. So creating a gap. So I don't know if you've ever been to Great Britain. On the subways, they have a big sign that says "Mind the Gap." So for the next week, if we could actually look at this gap and see what happens. And what we want to try and do is create a little space around the event. We want to create a little space around the event, and then returning to our breath, taking a deep breath in, making some space around the event, and with a gentle kindness, just looking at what goes on with our thoughts, with our thought processes, how we are perceiving this event, what we are saying about this event, and looking within our body and seeing what happens in our body. Are we tightening our muscle? Are we tightening our fist? Are we getting angry about a situation over which we have no control? And then the question is there a way of exploring new ways of being with the situation? Is there some way to look at the situation differently? And just for the sake of experiment for this week, if we can practice making space around the events in our lives that we perceive as stressful, and then looking carefully at what our responses are, what our reactions are, and then deciding maybe we could try a different way of being with this situation. Is there a different way of being with the event? One of the questions about today, or that we had at the beginning of today's session, was about when we're meditating, the mind goes to the discomfort in the body. And so what sometimes happens is that there's a tendency to push away things that we don't want to happen. And when we push things away that we don't want to happen, what tends to happen is we create tension in the muscles. And it's almost like holding a beach ball underwater. So if we hold a beach ball underwater, we have to exert quite a bit of force on the beach ball to not let it come up above the water. And so that much force, that much tension goes into pushing the event away. And sometimes if we actually just allow the event to emerge and just be present, it takes much less effort, much less pressure from us, just allowing it to be. So if there would be a way to look at the events that happen in our lives, because most of the things that happen in everyone's lives, we don't have a whole lot of control of. We only have control of one thing, and the thing that we have control of is our reaction to the event. We can't actually change many of the events that happen in our lives. We have to find a different way of being with them. So this is a pretty tall order to ask people to start looking at some of the ways in which we are with the events. I'm just going to go one more slide. And what I'd just like to do is, can I mute it for a second? I'm just going to be back to you in half a second. Sorry. Okay, so we talked about this before, is that it doesn't matter if the threat is real or imagined, the stress response is the same. Same physiological response. If we imagine things, it's the same. If we're imagining threat or failure, it's the same as if it really is there. Any perceived stress is just as powerful as a tiger attacking us. And sometimes when we, for example, beat ourselves up and compare an actual situation with what we wish it to be, it's just as powerful as having a tiger attacking us. Or if we beat ourselves up, or we make things, we sit and kind of think over and over and over again about the disturbing event, the distressing event, if we are constantly self-critical with ourselves, or if we're always angry at the world, all of those things create the stress response within the body. There is no difference between a real stress response and an imagined stress response. So ruminating about a negative event is just as powerful as a lion or a tiger attacking us. And sometimes what happens is, if, for example, a lion or a tiger were attacking us, it would be a whole lot better for our body because we would have to actually run to get away from it. And if we ran to get away from it, then we would burn up some of the chemicals that are secreted in response to the stress response. But when we are only sitting ruminating about a negative event, we create the same response in our body, and we can't escape from our thoughts unless we make some effort to change them. And so basically our body is stewing in its own juice. So it's stewing in its own juice. If we sit and allow ourselves to ruminate, or if we avoid dealing with our emotions, or if we're pessimistic, or if we constantly deny situations and we avoid dealing with it, all of those things create the same physiological response. And part of it is that our mind-body is pretty unsophisticated, and this stress response has been around for eons, and it is just the same as if we imagine it or it really is there. So the beliefs and attitudes and perspectives, when we're semi-conscious, so when we are not really aware of where our thoughts are, then the thoughts take us wherever they want to. So some of the things that we are attempting to do through the meditation is to become aware. Meditation is leading us to consciousness of what our thoughts are and where our thoughts are going and where our thoughts are taking our body physiologically. And in addition, we are exploring what our associations are, where our mind wanders to. Do we go back to ruminating about something that happened in the past? And sometimes we have memories that are actually stored in the body tissue. So exploring some of those things. Sometimes we have the stress response becomes so reinforced that it basically fires off instantly, and it gets better through the rehearsal. And so what we're attempting to do through looking at our thoughts and our connections is we're trying to find a new way of responding. So granted that the new way of responding will not be easy. It will be quite difficult at first, but if we can, for example, when something happens, take a deep breath. So returning to the breath for a few minutes, and maybe even 3 deep breaths, and making some space around between the event and the response in the mind, and then exploring with a gentle kindness what it is we're doing, what it is we're saying to ourselves, how it is we're being, and what happens in our body, and then thinking of practicing a new way of being with the situation. And so it's going to be slow at first. It'll go very slowly at first, but it's well worth the effort to see if we can find a new way of being with situations. So this is our cartoon, and this is how we would never want to go to a job interview. The fellow says, no, work-related stress isn't a problem. I've never taken a job seriously enough for it to bother me. So we don't want to quite get to that place, but we want to just practice a different way of being with our thoughts and with a situation that arises. So I'm going to ask Michael if any questions have come up during our talk today. Michael?
No, Linda, we haven't really had any. Let me just have a... Actually, we did have the one here. The attendee writes that she finds, as Linda has mentioned, when she gets overtired and overstressed and has not had a chance to take time out, she finds negativity sets in, and it's extremely difficult to cope in a reasonable manner. Any advice for short-term help, please?
I think probably it's again about recognizing what the body needs in that situation. So yes, it does happen, is that when we haven't had adequate sleep and when we haven't allowed ourselves to rest, it is pretty hard to see things in anything but a negative fashion. And so sometimes just the realization that that is the situation, is that I haven't had adequate sleep. I'm not seeing things clearly today because I haven't allowed myself to rest, and then basically giving yourself permission to take the time to rest, giving yourself permission to avoid dealing with the situations that arise when you know that you're tired. So it's a very careful awareness of what is going on for us. What is going on for us? If we haven't had sleep, then we have to give ourselves a break and say, okay, I haven't slept well last night. I need to take some time. And actually, it's a good thing to think about, is that nothing is really right up against us. There's nothing that we really have to respond to, generally speaking, instantly. We don't have to respond immediately to situations. And so giving ourselves time, so making space around that situation and what the response is. So if you're finding one day that because you're tired or because you're having a bit of a difficult time, you can't see anything but the negative in things, then moving it to another day, giving yourself permission to move it to another day, allowing yourself to do that, because you would allow your best friend to do that. And so remembering that you are your own best friend.
Do we have time for another question, Linda?
Yes.
One of our attendees writes, as a parent, are there practical things that you suggest I might do to help and support my elementary school children to be more mindful, to help them deal with the stresses in their increasingly hectic world?
I think taking time out and doing some of the simple breathing exercises with children is really helpful. 1 or 2 or 3 minutes sitting and breathing and exploring with the child what is going on for them, and actually some of the things that we're talking about are pretty simple and basic, of actually noticing what goes on and noticing the tension in the muscles, bringing awareness to the breath, and taking maybe just 3 minutes of time out. And I think that people are so busy these days, is the time out might be the most important thing, is taking some space and allowing space around things and not making them so instant, so that we're so busy communicating with every which device that we have that we never have any space in our lives these days. So I think making some space for children is important.
Yes, and that just about does it in terms of questions for this week. Oh,
okay.
Actually, hold on. I have one more question here. Is there a quick technique on how to stop ruminating over past events?
Well, there probably are lots of them. There's a kind of the one that I'm familiar with is putting an elastic band around your wrist and snapping it every time you notice that there's a constant ruminating thought. That's one way of doing it. It's just a reminder that this thought is coming up over and over again, and consciously changing the focus to a new thought. And also, you can, as opposed to snapping an elastic band, you can just return to the breath. That snapping of the elastic band is not really a mindfulness technique. I think it's a cognitive behavioral therapy technique where you actually notice the thought, and if it's repeating, is to snap a band to try and bring you to your senses, so to speak. So it's also possible to just drop into the breath, and each time the mind goes there, return to the breath. Each time the mind goes there, return to the breath. And slowly, over time, the new pathway will get worn into the brain. So I think for this week, our homework is to practice the meditation, the actual sitting meditation. And so in the practice of the sitting meditation, last time we did a really short little few-minute meditation, which we won't have time for today. But last week we did one with floating the thoughts down the riverbank or down the stream. The meditation that is on the resource posting is actually a 35-minute meditation. So if we can practice that this week and do maybe as much of it as you can each day, so sitting and just noticing the thought and letting the thought go and returning the attention to the breath. So practicing with that particular technique. And then next week we'll get back together and we're going to talk about our last session, which is about communication. So in addition to practicing being with events in a different way, I'd ask you to start to look at the ways in which communication might cause stress in your lives. So starting to look at things and ways of communicating that may be causing stress.